Okay, good evening everybody, and welcome to another London lecture in the series Remembering and Forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Thanks very much for coming. Without more ado, I'd like to welcome this evening's speaker, James Dawes. James is DeWitt Wallace Professor of English at Macalester College in Minnesota, but to describe him simply as a professor of English is to miss the breadth of his interests, which span AI, human rights, and the ethics of storytelling across a wide variety of media, addressing questions such as what does the storyteller have to suffer to tell their stories, and who owns narratives of suffering. With degrees from Cambridge and Harvard, his books include That the World May Know, quotation from Milton, isn't it? Thank you. Bearing Witness to Atrocity, and Evil Men, which won the International Human Rights Book Award. And revealing another side of the theme of remembering and forgetting, his talk this evening is entitled, What is Trauma? Jim, over to you.
So, thank you. Is the mic good? Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I haven't been here in about a decade, but this is an especially nice visit because I brought my son, and tomorrow we're going to the college where me and my wife met. So it's delightful to be here. Thanks. So for this series on remembering and forgetting, I'm going to talk about trauma. Early researchers in trauma described it as a disease of memory, and trauma is, unfortunately, a phenomena that we cannot forget, at the same time that we sometimes cannot remember it clearly. It's something we may want to forget, but also feel like we have to remember in order to recover as individuals or collectives. So tonight I'll talk about its history, its definition, and how that definition can change the way we experience trauma. So in 2006 actually, the iconic US comedy newspaper, The Onion, does anyone here know The Onion? They did an article satirizing US trauma culture. Its title reads, Report, More US Soldiers Suffering from Pre-Traumatic Stress Disorder, mocking the way that trauma had become a catch-all phrase for distress in the US after 9/11. It summarized the at-risk populations as anybody who watches TV 3 hours a day. Not quite 2 decades later, PTSD is not a joke. It is a very real thing and is being used to study things like, for instance, dread related to climate change. So trauma has evolved really significantly since it first emerged in Anglophone culture in about the 19th century. When it started, it had 3 key features. It was experienced by individuals, it was triggered by an event, and the event was shocking and extraordinary. Now it is the opposite. The opposite is true. It is experienced by collectives. It is experienced by, caused by chronic experiences rather than acute events. And the events can be common and even ordinary. Where trauma was once a very rare diagnosis, today PTSD, which is essentially synonymous with trauma, is the 4th most common diagnosis in the US. So this has led to some pretty intense debate in US, and I'm guessing British culture, yes, about trauma, between trauma skeptics and trauma believers. For trauma skeptics, the evolution from a rare state to a common state is an example of concept creep, which is basically an idea that has been stretched so far it is no longer useful. In this case, the idea is that it blurs the distinction between major difficulties and minor difficulties, and thereby cultivates cultures and identities defined by vulnerability rather than resilience. In fact, a prominent British psychiatrist, David Summerfield, ignited public controversy in 2001 when he made the argument that PTSD was more of a socio-political construct. It didn't have an objective status as a disease. And it was, I'll let you see what he said. He writes, the trauma industry has made PTSD the means by which people seek victim status and its associated moral high ground in pursuit of recognition and compensation. Once it becomes advantageous to frame distress as a psychiatric condition, people will choose to present themselves as medicalized victims rather than as feisty survivors. Trauma skeptic. For trauma believers, by contrast, the alarmingly high stats about the prevalence of PTSD ring true. We have moved into an era of global trauma, comprehensive trauma, for the same reasons we've moved into an era of 100-year storms occurring every year, temporary refugee camps being permanent, hypervisible mass killings becoming invisible background, and pandemics becoming daily life. Mental health experts have used the phrase cascading collective trauma to try to capture this new reality in which individuals accumulate a kind of psychic weight from experiencing traumas, mass public traumas that occur in quick sequence or overlapping. I'm going to guess for many of you that a good example would be 2020, the summer. So COVID was in full bloom. In the US, George Floyd was murdered, and I understand that caused repercussions here too. And it was also a heat wave, likely climate change related, that produced the highest recorded temperature in the history of the globe at 130 degrees in Death Valley. So it all kind of comes together as one collective trauma event. So what is trauma and how do we define it? Is it objectively real, like as real as a broken bone or a punctured lung? If you think this, you are a trauma universalist. Universalists believe that there are some truths that transcend culture and time. And in this case, the truth is that PTSD is a physiological reality. It is built into our DNA, and it is real even if a culture chooses not to recognize it. Or you might think that trauma is instead a cultural invention, a new invention that we use to regulate emotional and behavioral norms. If you think this, you're a trauma relativist. A relativist believes that the claims universalists make are essentially cultural imperialism, that these truth claims are ways of shutting down understanding of cultural and psychological difference rather than opening up our understanding. And for instance, with trauma, we know when researchers study trauma in non-Western cultures, they find that using PTSD as a diagnostic tool isn't helpful. It doesn't capture the broad range of reactions people can have with trauma, and it's better to use local explanatory models and idioms of distress if you want to have effective treatment programs. So I'm going to talk about this debate, the sort of skeptical and believing debate, by putting it in a historical context. I'm going to walk us through the key inflection points of trauma from the first moments in written history. From the first moments we see trauma possibly occurring in written accounts from Greece to today, where we're in fact we're reinventing trauma as a concept. And I think we're going to see in each case that this debate between skeptics and believers is not new. It has a very long, an ancient tradition, really. And this ties into the nature of trauma itself, what I think of as the subjective paradox of trauma. So if you are a sufferer of PTSD, the symptoms are intense. Flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, panic attacks. They're as real and pervasive as a weather pattern. But they're also easy to misunderstand, and they can be invisible or unbelievable to those around you. In fact, even the sufferer themselves might repress their trauma and misunderstand it and think their symptoms are just part of their personality or unrelated. So there's this dual reality where trauma is intensely real to the individual, but also subject to extreme doubt by those around them and even to the sufferer themselves. And this dual reality of trauma has been a real problem in diagnosis and treatment and definition since ancient Greece. So to start there at the beginning, the word trauma comes from the Greek word for a physical wound. And a question that we are now changing our answer to is, was there an accompanying psychological concept of trauma in ancient Greece, combat trauma, let's say, to accompany this physical sense of trauma? Until very recently, the answer was absolutely not. There appears to be no evidence at all of a notion of a syndrome of trauma in ancient Greece. They engage in almost constant and vicious hand-to-hand combat, but appear not to have had an idea that these experiences of shock or fright could lead to long-term clusters of symptoms that might be hard to treat or change behavior. As one history of trauma writes, the idea that a dangerous or frightening event may cause lasting psychological difficulties does not appear in recorded history literally anywhere until relatively recently. But it's not actually clear what an absence of concern with trauma really means. It could mean trauma didn't exist. So, and maybe it didn't. Maybe trauma was not a problem medically or socially in ancient Greece. It could be because, taking combat as our primary case study, their soldiers were psychically fortified by community rituals that better prepared them for combat and better reintegrated them into culture afterwards. And so they did not suffer from trauma in the way our culture does. It could be, on the other hand, that trauma is a uniquely modern phenomenon. say, born of industrialized warfare. That there's ancient soldiers had very different experiences of trauma from contemporary soldiers. They had nothing like the experience of being shelled, concussive shelling, the relentlessness, the way it erases agency so completely. Ancient soldiers felt nothing like what modern soldiers feel, and so maybe combat trauma is new in the world. It's possible. It's also possible, though, that trauma was real and it was a medical and social problem, but we don't see it when we look at the ancient records because we're looking the wrong way or they didn't see it. So take, for example, what was identified by psychiatrist Jonathan Shea as the berserk state during the war in Vietnam. This was a kind of sudden mental breakdown brought on by successive traumatic events that manifest as indifference to death and frenzied rampage. This was a very serious disease, which was eventually absorbed into PTSD as a concept. This happens all the time in the Iliad. The Greeks were very clear about this phenomenon, but for them, it was not a disorder. It was what they called an aristeia, which comes from the Greek word for the best. It represented a soldier's finest and most exhilarating moments. So, just to fill that out with an example, the story of Aristodemus, he's the sole survivor of the Battle of Thermopylae. So in the war against the Persians, there's this, according to lore, 300 Spartans held off 100, 200,000 Persians for 3 days. Leonidas dismissed Aristodemus right before the last stand because he'd injured himself and his eye was infected and he was essentially blinded. So they sent Aristodemus home, and the next day, the soldiers had their final famous last stand and all died. Because of this, Aristodemus, he didn't embody the culture's ideals of masculinity, so he was shamed and forever after known as Aristodemus the Trembler. And Herodotus writes that he was stigmatized and depressed. Quote, "No Spartan would give him fire or speak with him." So eventually he breaks. And at a subsequent battle later, when he's recovered, he charges ahead alone into the enemy lines and fights until he dies. And the Spartans look at this and they say, okay, his reputation is restored. He has done great deeds. So we might see this as a kind of study for how ancients and moderns see this so differently. For the ancients, that was an aristeia. He fought bravely to death. For us, we could see that as combat suicide by somebody who broke, someone who was traumatized. So it might be that they didn't identify it because they were simply overlooking those who suffered it. All right, moving on, leaping all the way to the Middle Ages. We also see no concept of a syndrome of trauma. Again, there's always been this notion that people suffer, but this idea that it could extend into time and change personhood in key ways. There's no sense of that in the Middle Ages, but we nonetheless might see something like PTSD. In fact, the most recognizable figure in British literary history reads like a case study in PTSD. So in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth writes The Life of Merlin. And Merlin, if you've read this, Merlin starts off as a soldier, suffers tremendous trauma in battle, and immediately runs off to the wood to live as a crazed hermit. He suffers for years from depression, mood swings, irritability, classic PTSD symptoms. Monmouth does not call it PTSD, and Merlin in the text doesn't. Merlin says, "I was taken out of my true self." But the explanation was that these were the unforeseen consequences of his gift of second sight and prophecy. Had nothing to do with trauma. Just so, the Catholic friar, St. Francis of Assisi, he is in some ways a classic example of someone from PTSD. He was held as a prisoner of war for a year, and afterwards he's released, and he's reckless, he's estranged from family, he's depressed. His hagiographers do not explain this as war trauma. The concept doesn't exist. Instead, they use a very readily available religious trope, which is that God was punishing him in mind and body to push him along the path to conversion so that he could become the person he was. This idea that the suffering of earthly life, these travails of living, are the very things that forge us into the likeness of God, that's a really common medieval theological religious experience. So it can explain maybe why what we might see as trauma was seen very differently by them. So 2 quick examples. Marjorie Kemp was a famous medieval mystic. She experienced a traumatic birth, and afterwards, for quite a long time, she would have hallucinations. She would engage in really consistent and loud and publicly disruptive weeping. And people saw this as a touch of the divine, not as trauma. Just so Christina the Astonishing, another mystic, she was almost buried alive. And after this traumatic event, and possibly some other traumatic triggers, she renounced earthly possessions. She began a life of mendicant begging and truly shocking acts of public self-harming, which people did not see as trauma or disorder. They saw it instead as God touching her to reveal the suffering of purgatory to those around her. So we might see trauma, but I have to just add as a kind of caveat, making retroactive psychiatric diagnoses like this is really risky for all kinds of reasons. I think psychiatrists are comfortable doing that at the general level. So they will, for instance, look at Hippocrates and say, well, his concept of mania was in fact bipolar. Or they'll look at the ancient Christian church and say, well, their sin of sloth was in fact depression. They're comfortable doing that, but to diagnose someone like Marjorie Kemp or Christina the Astonishing, this is a much riskier adventure for two reasons. One, we just have almost no data, and no self-respecting psychiatrist would do that for someone at such a distance. But also, it's really a way of, when they leave their life stories to us, our ancestors, it's a way of not listening to them. It's a way of delegitimizing what they say they were experiencing. And it's a way of entirely dismissing spiritual and ecclesiastical worldviews. So there's real risks in doing it, but I think nonetheless, if we proceed with caution, they can be useful points of insight into the history of trauma or the potential history of trauma. So moving on to the Enlightenment, we shift away from religion as a primary frame for explaining behavior. And that's when we suddenly see trauma beginning to emerge as a potentially medical diagnosis. So in 1688, Johannes Hofer, he's a medical student, and for his dissertation, he coins the phrase nostalgia. And nostalgia is meant to explain this very mysterious disease that Swiss mercenaries are suffering while fighting abroad. And he theorized that, in his words, the continuous vibration of animal spirits in the brain was causing the symptoms, and this was caused by homesickness, the vibrations, was causing symptoms like refusing to eat, neglecting self-care, suicide. So nostalgia was a lethal disease for these soldiers abroad. Some counter that, in fact, it wasn't vibrations from homesickness, but it was, in fact, pressure change, which will come up later. Pressure change going up and down mountains, or in one case, a quite serious theory, there was clanging of cowbells that actually caused brain damage and caused what we'd call PTSD for soldiers. But homesickness was really the theory that lasted. And it lasted for a long time up until the 19th century. So in the US Civil War, 6,000 Union soldiers were diagnosed with nostalgia. And I think 74 died of nostalgia. It was considered a very real disease and a potentially contagious disease. But at the same time, this is where you see the skepticism, it was also seen as maybe a sign of weakness, feebleness, and maybe cowardness. In fact, if you were a veteran after the Civil War trying to claim benefits, if you mentioned psychological things like nostalgia, your chance of getting benefits dropped by 30%, according to the studies we have. So it was real, but also suspicious. Nostalgia was also a diagnosis used to make sense of the behavior of captive Africans brought to the Americas as slaves. They seemed often healthy, but nonetheless displayed symptoms of being unable to work, what we would call perhaps trauma, perhaps depression. And so they thought it was nostalgia. And one plantation surgeon describing this said that, surprisingly, the African captives appeared sad and resentful, stubbornly insisting on not eating, not even drinking, even though they have hunger and thirst enough to kill them. And so he thought it was the atmosphere problem from the original Swiss studies on nostalgia, and that being taken from the land to the boat to the plantation caused some atmospheric changes. And so to cure the enslaved persons of their potentially lethal nostalgia, you had to reduce the pressure of the external air that compresses them. And this was a serious concern. They cared about it because it affected productivity, And they cared about it because it affected survival on the trade ships. One prominent captain explained in 1841 that all the slaves died of nostalgia. And they had to have a cure, so what they often did, quite horribly, was they would deliberately infect all the captive slaves with scabies. It's quite awful, contagious, itchy skin disease, because the idea was that distress would distract them from the nostalgia, which could kill them. The nostalgia could kill them, and so it was better. You could increase average survival by having everyone have scabies instead. So, moving on, the modern history of trauma, the really medical history that we have, doesn't begin with the Civil War or slavery. It begins with railroads, and it begins in England. In 1865, Charles Dickens got in a train wreck near Staplehurst, Kent, as his train hurtled over a 42-foot gap in a bridge that was being repaired. 7 cars in front of him sort of fell down, 10 died, 40 injured, and his car dangled over the edge, and he kind of heroically rescued people from the car, helped the dead and the dying on the side for about 3 hours. After this, he suffered from severe symptoms, temporary mutism, paralysis, what he called the shake and rushes of terror that afflicted him the rest of his life. It's hard for us now to get a sense of why these train accidents were so terrifying, because we are all so accustomed to catastrophic industrial accident. But in the 19th century, they had no psychological immunities built up to that kind of thing. This was terrifying. These accidents, the scale, the violence, the suddenness, the sensational newspaper industry that described them, it caused a lot of public anxiety. And one aspect of that public anxiety was the behavior of people like Dickens. People who survived these train wrecks seemed fine, but couldn't sleep, couldn't work, had nightmares, displayed what we would think of as some version of PTSD. It didn't make any sense to them. So, in 1866, John Erik Erikson published On Railway Spine and Other Injuries of the Nervous System. And his hypothesis for Dickens and people like Dickens was that there were these invisible concussions of the spine that left no physical traces, but nonetheless had quite serious consequences. And so he writes in his medical report, if you have these invisible spinal concussions, death may be postponed for weeks, months, or even years. There may be in such cases remission or abatement, but no real intermission or suspension of the symptoms. The chances of recovery are very small. So railway spine sparked significant controversy for a couple reasons. On the one hand, was it physical or was it mental? People began moving to this idea that it could be mental. And also, was it real or was it fake? Again, the skepticism argument we see again. This was complicated by the fact that victims of railway accidents could make claims for compensation from the railway companies. And so people began to think maybe these survivors with these symptoms were faking for financial benefit. At the turn of the century, the same battle occurs in France and Germany over industrial workplace accidents. If you had a major injury in a factory or some industrial workplace, in Germany, you were said to suffer from pension hysteria, and in France, sinistrosis. And the idea was, it's a kind of cunning idea. The idea was that these injured workers who couldn't come back to work because of chronic pain, paralysis, headaches, you name it, they weren't actually hurt. They were, the promise of compensation was so enticing that it incentivized them to sort of morbidly fixate on their body and hysterically generate real to them symptoms that were nonetheless actually fake. And so they had hysteria, they had pension hysteria. So once again, you see here with the birth of trauma in the modern world, the same divide between belief and skepticism, defining the argument from the start. This all takes a major turn with Freud, who he began his study of psychogenic illnesses, mind-produced illnesses, when he was studying in Paris as a young doctor, railway spine, with a famous neuroscientist. After that, his work takes a major new direction when he theorizes that the symptoms of his adult patients, so again, mutism, fainting, paralysis, memory loss, he began to theorize these were all caused by early childhood sexual experiences, sexual assault for his patients. Freud developed his work alongside Pierre Janet, who established the concept that we really have now of disassociation. So his idea was with disassociation, consciousness essentially splits. And it takes traumatic events and it puts them in compartments elsewhere so that the mind can continue with daily functioning. Freud's theory of repression isn't identical, but for basic purposes, it's the same. And the therapeutic claim is that the mind buries trauma, and to move forward, the therapist needs to use the talking cure to recover those deleted memories and integrate them into conscious daily experience. And that's the curative process. His startling claim that this was all from sexual abuse met with very significant resistance among the patriarchal community of his time. And even though he stood by what he called the seduction theory for 2 years, he eventually changed his mind. It seemed to Freud and to his colleagues that there was no possible way decent Viennese families were committing sexual abuse like this. And so instead he posited that the memories these people told him were fabrications. And in fact, a better way to explain their neuroses was the Oedipus complex, which is essentially infantile sexuality and repressed desires manifesting over a lifetime, a universal aspect of human development. And what's interesting here is Freud kind of sets up the whole framework for how the modern world will react to trauma and how our culture is reacting to trauma, which is on the one hand, he denied it. He just said it wasn't true. This didn't happen. And on the other hand, he universalized it. He said, but everybody has it. Everybody has this sort of traumatic coming into being as sexual adults. So it's the same sort of binary we see. It's not real, it's everything. So after Freud, World War I is our next major shift in the history of trauma. I should say, Freud also sets up, I think, a gender binary. With his work, we see finally the gender binary of trauma coming into being quite clearly. On the one hand, for men, trauma is to be unmanned. It's to be Aristodemus. It's to be the man who can't fulfill courage and bravery and all the ideals of masculinity that your culture wants. For the woman, trauma is hysteria. It's false symptoms. It's making up fake claims, like Marjorie Kemp, the medieval mystic I mentioned, whose tearfulness in public was often accused of being fake and attention-grabbing rather than anything real. So Freud really does set the framework for how we think about trauma today. World War I changes things again, because now trauma is undeniable. Combat trauma is a strategic problem for the military. Estimates are that 250,000 people were debilitated by what we would think of as PTSD, by combat trauma, by the end of World War I. The diagnosis at the time for this was shell shock, and this was given in 1915, the first time the word appears in the medical literature, by Charles Myers, who identified the very first case of shell shock in history, which was a private who, coming back from the front, got separated from his platoon and caught in a little barbed wire trap. They went on and some shells exploded near him. He was entirely uninjured, but mysteriously suffered from vision problems, hearing problems, emotional disturbances, and so they had to have a theory. And so shell shock becomes a theory, and it's something like railway spine. The idea is that these invisible concussions from the shells affected the brain and caused these symptoms. It starts the same debates that we saw with railway spine. Is it mental? Is it physical? Is it real? Is it fake? Are they cowardly or weak? And treatments for this tended to match which interpretation you had. So on the one hand, you had Dr. William Rivers, who had a really remarkably modern talking cure for veterans suffering from combat trauma, from shell shock. And on the other hand, you had horrible, horrible electric shock therapy. The accounts are quite terrifying. I'll read just a snippet from one French doctor who was very successful and proud of the way his combination of electric shock and screaming at people could take someone who was depressed, incurably depressed, and produce very sudden cures. And so here's what he says. To get them, we had to engage in a real battle. For an hour or sometimes 2 hours, we would hound them with exhortations, repeated 1,000 times in different ways. Insults very often unjust. Oaths, anger manifested in various ways, all supported by strong galvanic excitation. Shock. And through this, we had the impression they were resisting recovery that they wished at any price to not get well. But a moment later, they became and remained happy. This was not the worst of it, though. Sometimes there was not treatment, there was just court-martialing. The British military sentenced 2,200 soldiers to death for cowardice in World War I and executed 306. We don't know all the details, but almost certainly many of these men were suffering from PTSD. There's one case, a man named Harry Farr, who may be emblematic of the time. So he was 25 years old, and he was in trench warfare for a year. After a year of constant shelling, he developed the shakes. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking. So they sent him to a hospital. The letters we have now, they sent to his wife Gertrude, unreadable because he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. But eventually he's declared well. He's sent back to the front. He keeps fighting. He fights in the Battle of the Somme, which remains, I believe, the most bloody infantry battle in the history of the world. 5 months long and 1 million dead, as I recall. He fights through this. He survives. Eventually, though, he breaks. Not even in a combat moment. His platoon is marching somewhere unimportant, and he suddenly finds he can't march anymore. And he says, I can't go on. So they assemble a 20-minute court-martial, sentence him to death, and execute him the next morning. And his wife, Gertrude, with 2 children at home, impoverished, goes to collect her pension and is denied because the policy at the time was that wives of cowards could not receive pensions. So the next inflection point is the experiences of non-combatants and refugees in World War II. Throughout the 50s, a whole range of researchers were trying to find some way to explain this new experience of trauma they were seeing, this new extreme version of trauma that did not seem to be well accounted for by the standard Freudian model. So they came up with all kinds of theories. Concentration camp syndrome, survivor syndrome, A-bomb neuroses. In the 1960s, following that, you see the first studies on intergenerational trauma. People began to see the children of Holocaust survivors. At first, the first study argued that the idea that trauma symptoms were being evidenced in the children was behavioral, that the parents were doing something behaviorally that manifests and the children absorbed it. Now we have evidence this is actually molecular, that trauma can trigger change epigenetic mechanisms that change the function of the DNA that gets passed on genetically to the children. So we see that now today. As significant, as significant as this work on the Holocaust and the atomic bomb was, trauma doesn't reach its turning point in history until the war in Vietnam. After a series of extremely bitter cultural and political battles, that's when PTSD gets invented as a concept, and everything changes. Veterans in the US who came back from Vietnam struggled mightily with all sorts of problems. Unemployment, substance abuse, interpersonal relations falling apart, and almost certainly much of this was either caused by or worsened by their combat trauma. But officially in the US, there was no such thing as a trauma combat stress diagnosis. It had been deleted from the record. In 1952, based on the work of psychiatrists with veterans from World War II, combat stress was a psychological disorder. It was called gross stress reaction, and it was included in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We call it the DSM. It's the primary coding mechanism for all official psychiatric disorders that can be treated. So gross stress reaction for combat was real after World War II, but it was very narrow. It could only last 6 months, and if it lasted more than 6 months, then clearly it wasn't combat stress and you needed another diagnosis. And eventually they just erased it. So the DSM gets revised every so often. By the time the DSM-2 came out in 1968, they eliminated it altogether, and there was no combat stress diagnosis for anybody. Anybody who evidenced fear related to military experience, they were told that they should diagnose this as adjustment reaction to adult life. So this deletion of combat stress as a disorder had very serious consequences for veterans. They got all of their behavioral problems tended to be seen through a disciplinary lens rather than a therapeutic lens. So people were dishonorably just discharged instead of treated. They were put in jail instead of treated, and this led to tremendous problems with employment again, with healthcare benefits, with families, with integrating into society. To make matters worse, the one place they were supposed to go for help, we call it the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the psychiatric services of the VA, they were aggressively against the idea that combat stress was real. One psychiatrist said that the concept was an insult to brave men, and the very small number of therapists from that time who did advocate for treating combat stress as a real thing recall in their writing being treated with contempt and derision. National blindness to PTSD in Vietnam, or to trauma in Vietnam, led to misunderstandings that were straight out of the Iliad. They were positively Homeric. So I'll tell one quick story. In 1971, the New York Times ran a story about an African-American man who was killed while robbing a liquor store. This is normally not major New York Times news, but the deceased in this case was Dwight Johnson, and he was a celebrated veteran. In fact, 3 years before, he'd been given the highest military honor the U.S. can give, the Congressional Medal of Honor, personally by Lyndon Johnson, the president. The New York Times ran an account after that award, and the General Westmoreland described it as heroism that earned him a special place in the annals of history. And this is what happened what he did to earn the award. Sergeant Johnson was serving as a tank driver when his vehicle was immobilized during a battle with North Vietnamese regulars. Sergeant Johnson left his tank armed only with his .45 caliber pistol and killed 7 enemy soldiers while under constant heavy fire. He returned to the tank for his submachine gun and attacked the enemy, again risking his life. When that weapon ran out of ammunition, he pulled a wounded GI from another tank, but returned to fire its cannon until it was out of shells. He says, "I don't know how many I killed. I wasn't thinking, I wasn't counting, I was just shooting." He told of passing out after the battle and waking up the next day in the hospital. So just a few months before he died, before he was shot to death in the liquor store, he was being treated for depression at a VA center. He took a weekend pass, left, and never returned. And I think this is one of those cases like with Aristodemus, right, where we can see this very differently. Now, at the time, US culture celebrated this as an Aristeia, his finest moment. I think we might be more likely to see it as a berserk state, as a traumatic state, as a breakdown, a combat suicide. So veterans who were really disillusioned with and felt betrayed by the establishment that was meant to protect them began to try to find alternative treatment pathways. And so in the 70s in New York, in the early 70s, they gathered together to have group rap sessions in what they actually did call safe spaces for themselves to discuss how hard their lives were, how difficult it was, how nobody understood them. One of the volunteer therapists there, eventually in 1971, I believe 72, writes an article in the New York Times proposing that we invent a term called post-Vietnam syndrome to account for the suffering of these soldiers, in his words, for the way their never-ending past deprives the present of meaning. So at this time, the DSM, again, is going through another revision. So advocates and psychiatrists and researchers began using this time to try and advocate for the inclusion of some kind of combat stress in the new DSM. It was not an easy sell. One of the therapists lobbying for legislation for funding and also a name change or an introduction of a name for stress says this is what happened when he went to a Texan congressman's office to discuss it. When I came into his office to talk with him, he wore his Medal of Honor from World War II around his neck. He'd say, "How can you little wimps be sick? Need counseling. A tour of duty only lasted 12 months. In World War II, soldiers fought in the war for years. How could you be traumatized?" So against widespread charges of being fakers, snowflakes, liars, cowards, they continued advocating, and by 1980, everything changes. Congress begins giving money for substance abuse and psychological training or support for veterans. The VA changes its system, so they start having more of these group rap sessions for treatment and develop an institutional structure around it. And in 1980, PTSD is created as a legitimate psychiatric diagnosis for Vietnam vets, for survivors of the Holocaust, and survivors of natural disasters. And this is the moment that kind of changes everything. It's a pivotal shift. It sets up a kind of lasting institutional framework after millennia of neglect for people suffering from trauma. Interestingly, it also paved the way for its own undoing as a diagnosis. In particular, it paved the way for women veterans and African American veterans to begin rethinking trauma themselves. They began to rise up through these new grassroots vet center organizations, the new way they did the VA, and they started talking about how their experiences as women veterans or African American veterans made it worse, how their trauma was compounded by their identity. And their advocacy becomes part of this broader movement we see blossoming today around inclusivity and in particular intersectionality. I know that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. We can talk about it in Q&A if you want. So to give an example, Linda Vanderventer was one of about 1,000 women who served in Vietnam as an Army nurse. She was at an emergency evacuation hospital, which meant she worked 12 hours a day, grueling shifts in these chaotic environments, bodies strewn everywhere, young men who just begun living, dying in her arms. In her memoir, after the war, she talked about struggling with depression, substance abuse, and suicidality. She, in particular, argued that it was her recovery was made much harder because of her gender. She criticized the VA and the Department of Defense because they spent millions of dollars to get women to serve, but then did not track their health afterwards, and in particular, never publicly acknowledged that women veterans could get benefits after the war. Even wounded veterans who'd been treated by women like Linda Vanderventer couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of a woman having PTSD. She talks about how she met a leading trauma advocate, so a wounded veteran, who was now an advocate for this new model of PTSD. His whole job was about uncovering hidden cases, ignored cases of PTSD. And after meeting her, this is what he said: "Women veterans, we forgot all about women. My God, the thought never crossed my mind." So her life changes when she begins pursuing a degree in psychology, and she starts reading about PTSD. And she says, it sounded like reading her own profile. "The psychologists had not thought to include women in their studies, but I began thinking that if I had the same problems as the men, there must be plenty of other women in similar circumstances. There could be thousands of women vets experiencing PTSD who thought they were alone. My job would be to reach them before it was too late." And so she eventually does. She rises up in the system and becomes a counselor, training people how to counsel women in the VA. So the struggle of women and African American veterans gets tied into broader political cultural struggles in the US in the 70s that intensify and continue to this day. And a lot of that had to do with expanding and changing what we think of as PTSD. So in the early 70s, as part of what would become known as the battered women's movement, the very first shelters were established for women exposed to intimate partner violence. They were attacked for breaking up families, but the shelter model thrived. And eventually now they were 200, I think, by the end of the 70s. Now the estimates are there are about 3,000 shelters for battered women shelters. In 1977, Francine Hughes was acquitted of murdering her husband. She set him on fire in the bed he was sleeping in on the grounds of temporary insanity. That same year, Lenore Walker came up with a medical term for this, battered woman syndrome, which has since been used in many, many legal cases to explain the behavior of women who've been abused like Francine Hughes was for a decade, to explain their behavior, to explain the murder, often getting lesser charges than murder, manslaughter, or even really acquittals altogether. At the same time as domestic abuse was beginning to evolve into a legal and therapeutic field, sexual assault advocacy and research expanded in the 70s. The very first study on the psychological effects of rape was conducted in 1970. The first rape crisis centers were in 1971. In 1972, nurse Ann Burgess and sociologist Linda Holmstrom introduced the term rape trauma syndrome to the medical literature for the first time after a year of interviewing women in the Boston City Hospital. And they drew in particular attention to a term called traumatophobia to explain the symptoms of rape survivors. It's a term that was actually borrowed from war survivors. It's about phobic reactions in response to trauma. And for women that they interviewed, it manifests as fear of being indoors, fear of being outdoors, and fear of being alone. But then 1980 comes, and PTSD comes as a concept. And so post-Vietnam syndrome, battered women syndrome, rape trauma syndrome all get absorbed into PTSD as a concept. And researchers following these trends begin identifying commonality of symptoms between rape survivors, assault survivors, and combat veterans. And by the 90s, you get psychiatrist Judith Herman saying it's essentially the same thing. It's the same syndrome. But as she expands her research, she begins to say, however, PTSD does not fully capture the experiences of many women survivors, women in particular. Because for women, PTSD is modeled on men largely. It's modeled on circumscribed experiences like combat as a psychological model and profile. But for women survivors, it's often years or decades of domestic abuse or childhood sexual abuse, and that PTSD could not capture that experience properly. So she proposed the idea of CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which would account for people whose abuse or trauma wasn't an event, wasn't 6 months, wasn't a year, but was in fact a decade or perhaps more. And while it had overlapping symptoms with PTSD, it had different symptoms that needed attention, much more extreme problems with emotional regulation, more problems with establishing relationships, and more profound feelings of worthlessness. So feminist scholars who are working on PTSD begin to make the argument that PTSD as a concept, because it evolved from men fighting in wars, reproduced a really toxic binary for how cultures think about trauma. So on the one hand, you have public, agreed upon normal trauma, like a soldier. And on the other hand, you have secretive, abnormal trauma experienced by women, like childhood sexual abuse. Now it leads to this binary where one is understood and one is denied, questioned, or victim blamed. So new research on racism is also challenging our understanding of PTSD. In 2001, Chalso Liu conducted one of the very first studies establishing an empirical link between racism and trauma. Looking at Asian American veterans, she found that experience to race-related stress predicted PTSD over and above experience to combat and other stressors. And since then, many models have emerged, accounting for racism as a kind of trauma, racist incident-based trauma, race-based traumatic stress. The overall effect of this sort of research is to question the dominance of PTSD as a diagnostic model. They argue that this has become a concept that has narrowed rather than expanded our sense of the breadth of trauma reactions in our culture. And so this brings us back to The Onion, the article I started with, and I'll wrap up here so we can have some Q&A. In that small moment of humor in The Onion, there are some old things happening and some new things happening. Large cultural forces intersecting. So first, the new. The backlash against the expansion of trauma is a sincere and genuine reaction to this concept creep. As we can see from the history, trauma has always been very narrowly defined and quite carefully limited in how we diagnose it. And this rapid expansion in what we think of as trauma now in the past few decades is seen by many as an overcorrection. And it is potentially, they say, an overcorrection with damaging consequences if it leads to more frequent negative self-appraisals in people. So negative self-appraisals, essentially seeing yourself as helpless, as out of control. And people who engage in negative self-appraisal, research shows, suffer in terms of well-being because this reinforces their sense of helplessness in the face of difficulty and can be a bad thing. So that's the concern that's new. What's old, though, with this, as we see it as far back as we can look, we're seeing here in that mockery the same resistance that always emerges when marginalized people, in this case women, people of color, and young people, try to change mainstream culture, try to expand cultural norms. So if you put two things next to each other, put the Me Too movement next to the snowflake insult, the pressures that fueled the Me Too movement in 2017 were all about expanding our sense of the scope of trauma. And the pressure that led The Guardian to name Snowflake as the insult of the year in 2016 were all about shaming people for trying to expand our sense of the scope of trauma. These things are tied together like push and pull. But this shaming is not new. The medieval mystic who can't stop crying, the railway accident survivor who can't stop shaking, the World War I soldier who, after a year of fighting bravely, suddenly becomes a coward. These were the snowflakes of their time. So I will wrap up here. Just to repeat the question, what is trauma? I think if what we see now with the changes to PTSD, we're clearly not at the end of understanding what it is, any more than we were when we found out that railway spine existed or shell shock existed. There is no one thing that trauma is, even though trauma is real. It was different, is different, and likely will be different. And I will stop there.
Thanks very much for the talk, by the way. I was thinking about it. Do you think there's an evolutionary almost value to remember a memory which could kind of teach us about past and history? Is there almost a benefit to having trauma?
That's a great question. So clearly fear is a powerful evolutionary value. We learn to be cautious and to not repeat certain things. I wonder, are there any evolutionary psychiatrists or psychologists here? What's that?
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit evolutionary biological.
Yeah, but I mean, so I have to say, I don't know. My first instinct would be to say that it's not functional in terms of people's survival and behavior. But if there are any evolutionary biologists here, I'd love to hear. I honestly, I haven't thought about that. That's a great question. Were you an evolutionary biologist? No, okay.
Thanks. In comparison to, so first question, like, have you looked at kind of how different Eastern philosophies treat the concept of trauma? For example, like in Hinduism, they have a concept called samskara, which basically is a compilation of different life events and how they kind of result in a mental predisposition that then kind of emerges later in the future if certain circumstances arise.
And to you, does it seem similar to PTSD as a structure?
Effectively, yeah. That's kind of what they're claiming. Like, and kind of as a follow-up question, what do you think is the reason why kind of the Western psychology is trying to sort of create all these variations of PTSD? Like, is that generally helpful for treating PTSD? Because my assumption is kind of what you said. It is quite, well, it's very varied, but it's almost so varied that it's very difficult to put it in categories to a point where there's like no reason to do it.
Yeah, those questions are interestingly related. So for instance, if we look at how some studies that look at trauma in non-Western cultures, so for instance, PTSD would predict avoidance as a classic PTSD reaction. You tend not to see that in other cultures. By contrast, you might see somatic manifestations. So extreme body heat would be a clear sign of trauma in some cultures. Entirely unrecognizable to Western psychiatrists. That is not a major trauma signifier that you experience extreme body heat. So it really varies. So your first question, there's a different philosophy behind trauma and its conceptualization, but also a different experience of it. In fact, there are some claims that flashbacks as a mechanism of trauma, this is a modern idea of what trauma is. The claim by some researchers is that this concept did not exist until film, which is not to say it's fake, but that we're highly malleable, and the way we process the world is highly malleable, and so we acquire new ways of manifesting these deep internal injuries. So that's a bit to the first question, and I think that speaks to the second question, which is the breadth of trauma reactions are intense, and there has to be like a sweet spot, right? Because if you fragment it to the point where there's so many different ways of thinking about it, well, then it's not a single concept anymore. But if it's monolithic and excludes things, in this case, often based on race or gender, well, that's entirely unhelpful too. So I think we're in this moment now where there's a battle about it, and that's why in culture at large, you see so much anger and energy about it.
Hi, I'm a bit confused about the P in situations such as slavery, or if someone was born on Skid Row or something and still living on Skid Row to parents that are, how do you think about that? It seems like, is the P necessary to understanding trauma? Is it always backwards?
I was just talking to a friend about this who he was describing his work with his therapist, and his therapist keeps saying to him, you need to get to P before we can start the treatment because he's in a continuing situation. So there is something about like the cleanness of that idea that you were, say, in Vietnam and then you weren't and you can be treated. But that's not often how trauma works. For many, there isn't much of a post. Or you start the treatment before the post. But PTSD still tends to be the model we use for thinking about this.
I heard you briefly mention the role of epigenetics, which is in an active area of research right now. I was wondering, sort of follow up to what I just heard. I've heard some versions of depression theories describing that it's a physiological response mechanism which isn't necessary anymore. Like, for example, of inflammation. Evolutionarily, you're trying to stay away from people because you're sick. But if that mechanism kicks in when you're not sick, it's depression. Similarly, with post-traumatic stress, perhaps there is an evolutionary mechanism suited to make you deal with stress. But at the moment you come back from the war, it is still active. Do you think this has some evolutionarily relevant grounding?
Can you give me like one more sentence? So when you're imagining the functional aspect of it, what would that look like?
I imagine a stressful environment would in some way engage some epigenetic factors to make you more resilient to it.
Or even if not epigenetic, maybe like we might take the Aristea as an example. Like you become better at handling your stress because you're compartmentalizing
like
all your...
Like that berserk state, which is something which has to be activated in such a stressful situation. I imagine if that happens outside the battlefield, it would be pretty bad. And maybe psychiatrists would see the berserk state as equally harmful in both situations, but I utilitarianistically don't see as a berserk state actually being harmful in a situation where berserk states are needed.
So just to separate the two things you're saying, so I'm going to peel off epigenetics for a moment. So there's a book that was really popular in the US a while ago called The Gifted Child. I don't know if that came over here, but the idea was that for children growing up in conditions of abuse, they develop a their skill in handling trauma is rapidly developed. And so they learn, for instance, to stay near their abuser so that they can't be surprised, to be a hypervigilant reader of people's physical and tonal changes so they can't be surprised. All these behaviors of a child growing up make them a very effective manager of an abusive parent, highly functional. And you can imagine that if we want to talk about evolutionary utility. But when they get out of that circumstance and they're adults now, and they're hypervigilant, and they're lurking around people who are dangerous because it feels safer to be near the danger, it's highly dysfunctional. So you can, that might be another example of the way like functional trauma behaviors become highly dysfunctional when you're outside the trauma situation, if in fact there is a P to the situation. As for epigenetics, I suppose I'm not sure if that's necessarily linked, but it is a very interesting area of study. Am I missing a question on epigenetics, or are we kind of raising it more?
It's only relevant if it's observed to be genetically
right.
inherited.
And it seems pretty clear that increasingly so.
Sort of outside the environment, if that person later on has children, then it would be linked to epigenetics if they exhibit symptoms not explained by their environment.
Another outside the environment version. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Really brilliant historical account of social views of trauma. My views are very much that this is this interaction between traumatic events and traumatic experiences and human beings and how we react to them. I mean, one person you didn't mention, I don't know if you've looked into Bowlby and the attachment patterns. I'm sure you're aware of them. You were discussing children. So child born needs to attach, but you're attaching out of necessity to maybe somebody who's actually terrifying you as well, or a threat to you. So the dissociation is how you cope with that, because you end up in a situation where you need to love that person, you need that person to love you, quote, quote, but you're also frightened of them. So those two things are not compatible. So that's how the splitting, I understand, starts. Okay. So the dissociation then, I've seen brain scans of people, and you see that, well, so they explain them, the different sizes of different parts of the brain, where the brain has developed specifically because of that kind of situation. So by the time a child is, say, 6 years old, their brain is actually working quite differently to other people's. But then, and I've always thought that's the explanation. So then, of course, when the child is, at any time after that or during that period, or when you're older, you're in a traumatic or potentially traumatic situation. The triggers are there. The dissociation kicks in instead of the fight or the flight. And so the repeated behaviors, these women why are they marrying this alcoholic type person over and over again? Why are they being raped or abused over and over again? It's because one is the survival mechanism, but it's also the open door that allows them to continue to be. And this thing is curable, apparently, by talking therapy, which is where you're mentioning Freud's very wrong turn. I call him Freud the fraud for what he did. That very wrong turn. It's let down so many people. But one of the things you said, which I've only seen one other time in a paper by Lowenstein, was this genetic component. I've thought very much about the Bowlby side of it and the attachment and in combination with the dissociation, but not understood that there was a genetic component. Could you say a bit more about that and maybe reference a couple of the sources?
Sure.
Thank you.
And so just to underscore some of what you were saying. So Freud, he has some great ideas, and some of it relates to what you're saying. So he has this notion of the repetition compulsion. During World War I, soldiers came back, so you had this notion of drives, that humans were governed by certain kinds of drives. And initially, his idea was we were governed by the pleasure principle, that we were essentially hedonistic and sought to maximize pleasure, and that was a basic human drive. And then soldiers come back from World War I, and they defy this, because they are doing things that are painful. They are redreaming their trauma, they're having flashbacks of their trauma, they're reenacting their trauma in all kinds of ways, and he couldn't make sense of this. And so he comes up with the idea of the death drive, but more relevantly, the repetition compulsion, which is that people who've been through trauma do seem to repeat it over and over again. And if it's not a soldier repeating their trauma, it might be a child. And so therapists have converted this for children into this notion that if you had a relation of abjection to, say, a parental figure or a relationship that was damaging somehow, to deal with that trauma, two things happen. First, you want to replay the trauma on some basic level, because what's horrible about trauma is that you're out of control. And if you replay it, now you're in control, which is actually better. You're doing it over and again, but you're the one who's making it happen. So there's a sense of agency which you crave. And also, maybe if you do it over and over and over again, maybe you'll fix it. Maybe this time you'll get the answer in the relationship. So that's Freud's idea of how the repetition compulsion works. It's Freud's idea. And I see you shaking your head, and the loud. I'm sticking with dissociation, 100%. Yeah. And then, so epigenetic work is profoundly interesting across many domains. But I think that the simple idea is that we can track among survivor populations that the DNA seems to be functioning differently in the children. And this isn't behavioral, it's not choice, it's not being weak-willed. It is how trauma, the old Lamarckian idea that acquired traits can be passed on genetically is now true. We see that quite clearly.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. Apologies if you clarified this, but I wanted to loop back to two of the figures that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which are the trauma universalist, who sees trauma as something objective, and the trauma relativist, who sees something as a cultural invention. I'm wondering where you position yourself in relation to those characters.
Oh, this is the question I dread most. So I like to imagine myself as entirely even-handed and seeing all sides of this question. But I think we are all experiencing our ideas through our life experiences. And I have people in my family who have lived with severe trauma. And so I tend to believe in trauma as universal. It manifests differently. We had questions here that show how it can be theorized differently, and this can change how you physically experience it. But when you see people up close and live with people up close who've experienced trauma, it's just hard emotionally not to be a universalist about it.
And is it necessary to be a trauma universalist to do this sort of historical project that you're doing?
Okay, I might be misinterpreting your question, so correct me if I go off on the wrong tangent. So for instance, there's an anthropologist, I believe, Alan Young, I think I'm getting it right. And he's very much a relativist of trauma and sees trauma as like a trash can of symptoms that change over time and doesn't have an objective status as a disease. But he's careful to argue that that doesn't mean it's not real. Made up doesn't mean not real, if that makes sense. Made up can still seriously affect your life. Made up can still change culture, but it's made up. So I suppose I gave that very personal reaction. I shouldn't imagine that one must be a universalist about it to believe it can be real. You can be relativist and real, a believer in the real at the same time. Does that make sense? And was that responding to your question?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
The example he gave was of witchcraft, which I think was a very poorly chosen example, but that witchcraft isn't real, but for the time that, or cultures that have, or the time we had it in here in England, it was real and it had real effects in how culture and people's lives were lived. I think the people I know who know his work, combat survivors who know his work, find it deeply offensive because there's like a feather's width of distance between relativizing a concept and dismissing it.
I see your hand. I'm going to jump in. So can I follow up on that question? And this relates to something that you said quite early on in the talk about why were there so few manifestations or zero manifestations of trauma in ancient times. Maybe it was because they had different social mechanisms of dealing with combat and preparing people for it and reintegrating people after they'd finished. So this is kind of a way of pressing you on the universal versus relative question. Do you see, just suppose that there are effective, elaborated social mechanisms for that. Do you see that as a way of masking trauma, or do you see that as a way of, as it were, in those days, they didn't have trauma because they were so good at dealing with it?
That's a great question. Can I say both without looking like I'm copping out?
You can say what you like.
Yeah. I think it seems clearly true from the US experience of Vietnam that lacking preparation and lacking reintegration as communities was tremendously damaging to people for their experience of combat, their resilience in combat, and the recovery afterwards. So clearly those community rituals, notions of whether you can seek help even, they're built into community, do make a big difference. And that is the answer I would have given until you said maybe it's a way of masking too, and that's interesting. I'll just say that's really interesting. I'd like to think about that more.
Thank you, and actually you've perfectly dovetailed into the sort of area that I wanted to ask about. So thank you, James, for your talk. Another James, William James, talks about in his analysis of religion that some people actually sort of they imagine that they want to have some sort of incredibly traumatic experience in the hope that that will
transform their life and they will learn something about themselves through it. So you either have people who do suffer something and get a traumatic experience, or people who don't experience something but might fetishize and imagine they want to have a traumatic experience. And in the introduction, I heard the words stuff about narrative and story and who owns the story. And so I kind of wanted to ask down that side, do we overly fetishize trauma in the media in a way where people who don't have objectively deeply traumatic experiences desperately want to have something real in their life? And obviously people who do go through that are unlikely to advise that as a way of seeking transcendence. And how do we navigate that?
Yeah, so if I could answer that with a story. So there's a writer, she was a child of the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, eventually we get to a point where this idea, silence kills, never again, you must tell the story. And so she spent a great deal she wrote memoirs, and she spent quite a bit of her adult life telling her story and going to US high schools and telling the story of the Holocaust from her family's perspective. And in the beginning, she thought this was important work. And she'd have these high school kids would come up to her and they'd be weeping and their lives would be changed. And it felt great that she was fighting the battle against silence. And then at some point, something happened. I can't recall what the moment was. There was some student talking to her. And she's like, no, wait, this is about this kid who feels like her life has no stakes, that her biggest decision is what to watch on Netflix on the weekend. And she feels like my life should matter. And she had a kind of like a grandeur envy for someone who'd been through the Holocaust, and being able to weep and be near this person and then carry that forward into their self-narration afterwards gave her something more in her life, which for the woman who was talking about her experiences of the Holocaust was very upsetting. And so she stopped giving those talks because she didn't feel like the Holocaust should be used for someone's sense of existential paltriness. And so that's a very real thing, for sure.
Actually, my question is also related to the latest discussion. So these wars, COVID, mass shootings, they have also impact on communities. So can we also talk about that kind of a traumatic impact on the societies, on the communities, and how can the societies deal with that? For example, even sexual assault, even femicide can be a collective traumatic events, because if the system lets them happening, if the system lets women and children vulnerable. So what kind of impact, does trauma have on societies, and how can communities deal with that?
Yeah, so this is also an area of really interesting new research. And since I'm permitted, I'll try and answer this also with a bit of a story. So after the dirty war in Argentina, everyone knows the dirty war in Argentina, the junta, in the name of fighting communism, just murders thousands of people, college students in particular. They're taken and kidnapped and tortured and dropped into a river. And that's where we get the notion of the disappeared, right? So these kids disappear. And the mothers of these children begin gathering in front of where the dictator lives or works. They're called the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And every Thursday, I think it was, they gather, starting in the 70s perhaps. I'm going to get the details slightly wrong. And they gather once a week, every week. And it's dangerous. The initial leader of the movement she gets kidnapped and killed, and they get threatened. But they continue to meet because the idea that people can be disappeared and that can be erased is just unacceptable. And this becomes a traumatic wound for the society as a whole, which then governments begin realizing they have to work it out because they cannot move forward as a society with this collective trauma, very much a collective trauma that's affecting people. So a very strange is the wrong word, fraught thing happens. The government decides we're going to make a monument to the dead. Let's make this, well, let's say that our starting position is monuments to the dead, acknowledging trauma, acknowledging the disappeared is a good thing. It seems like the initial starting point for recognizing community trauma. So they make this park, and in the park there's this wall, and the wall there's names, but then there's also empty slots for all those who were disappeared, so no names. And it seems like it fits the model for how trauma should be treated in the community. And half of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo are in favor, and then half threaten to tear it down with pickaxes and hammers and believe it's the most offensive thing possible that could have been done. And the arguments are complex because it gets into some politics. But part of it was they felt like a monument was a way of erasing things, a way of saying, now we're done, and your kids are really gone. And they wanted history to remain an open wound, and that the openness of that wound was more important than the closure of a monument. So clear, and everybody got involved. It was a quite vituperative conflict over this monument. So clearly collective trauma is real. Clearly the self-narration of a nation matters in the same way as an individual, and how we deal with it is just as hard to figure out.
Going back to the fraud, Mr. Freud, he had a student called Carl Jung, as you probably know, and he had a solution to the trauma theory, which was hypnosis. What did you think about that? I noticed that you didn't bring that into your history.
Yeah. So it's my understanding that Freud was the one who sort of turned against hypnosis. That it was what's it name? It was a popular notion of treatment, which Freud initially supported and then turned against. And so in the kind of mainstream version of trauma, I think it was treated with suspicion. But treatments of trauma are across the board. And I have not followed hypnosis as a treatment pattern for trauma. Do you have things you can tell me about that?
I self-hypnose every day for the complex trauma, if you like.
And do you find that's supported in mainstream medical culture for you, or is it you're kind of
No, but it works. And you also referred to the critical thinking. That's something that I've experienced a lot, and that's why I've ended up in the different jobs I've done in my life as well. But yeah, you know, at the end of the day, we're talking about the importance of forgetting, aren't we? And this has helped me do that. And not so much forget, just live with the trauma and put it into perspective each day so that I can just get through my day without any drama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's a super helpful thing. I think I'll look more into that as a treatment program. Thank you.
Shall I speak? Oh, sorry. Hi. That was really interesting to hear about like the gaslighting through the ages. And I wonder what you thought, if you had any thoughts about like personality disorders and trauma. So it seems to be particularly for women who present with trauma, they're misdiagnosed with a personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or emotionally unstable personality disorder, just to make it sound even more insulting. Yeah, sorry, my heart is pounding in my chest. So I have complex PTSD, and for years it was like written off as BPD. And I think a big reason for that is that when it comes from abuse and when you're reporting abuse and people don't believe you, it's then easier to say, oh, but you're just paranoid, you're kind of making things up. So yeah, there's a real problem in the weaponizing of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I can't think of anything else to say.
No, that's super helpful. I mean, so in the US, I'm almost positive, I may be wrong, CPTSD is not in the DSM. That is not, is it officially real here?
No.
Right, but I know so many people for whom this is a life-changing way of self-understanding. Because one can be a trauma survivor and be told, oh, it's something else, and then believe that, right? And so I think what PTSD taught us is that advocacy by people who are suffering eventually changes medicine. And so I think CPTSD will eventually be a diagnostic category because everyone's using it now. It's a very helpful way of identifying a different set of symptoms, in some ways a harder set of symptoms for a different population, for sure, yeah.
So hello. I recognize that over history, there's been this obvious conflation between cowardice and PTSD, or what we now know as PTSD. But is there a modern distinction between fear, like a fear response, and PTSD or complex PTSD?
So if I'm not getting your question, correct me afterwards. But I think fear in so many ways is a very healthy reaction. Fear is a functional reaction. And all cultures have recognized that fear can affect people. But the notion that fear could cause long-term changes in a person's behavior, cause treatment-resistant long-term symptoms, that's entirely different, I'd say.
Sorry, I mean fear as part of the actual, as the response rather than part of the event.
So fear is a symptom of PTSD?
Yeah.
Yeah, for instance, in the case of the survivors of sexual assault and rape in that study I mentioned, traumatophobia is a functional fear reaction at a certain level. So survivors of war learn to avoid things, echoing some of the thoughts about evolution, like learn to avoid certain things because their brain has programmed that is dangerous. And so for a lot of survivors of sexual assault, fear is a functional, dysfunctional reaction to threat that can carry over as a symptom. So that there are certain things that just are terrifying to do because they're associated with danger. Am I getting your question now? Yeah, okay. Yeah, for sure.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I think you mentioned about collective trauma at the beginning of your talk when about 2020, the coronavirus and also temperature thing. I was wondering is there a clear definition of collective trauma, and also what do we use this term for? Like, what's kind of a utility we get from using this term or popularize this term in the literature?
So I guess I have to split that into two. So I think there's the collective trauma you were talking about, which we might recognize as like a post-war society, a post-apartheid society. Cascading collective trauma is actually a different thing. And the collective of that is, it's a digitally mediated concept. So this idea that we live in a world where we collectively experience, I don't know what would be a good example here, but in the US, the classic example is 9/11. Everybody collectively saw that on TV at the same time that everybody else saw on TV a school shooting in Sandy Hook. At the same time that everybody saw on TV news about climate change flooding the coastlines. So the collective of that is a digitally mediated collective phenomena, which is different because it's meant to be a short sequence of overlapping community tragedies, which is different from something like a historical collective trauma. So I guess there's just two versions of that, if that's helpful.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I have a comment and a question. The comment is following the Argentina example. Some regimes, based on my experience actually, have used creating the trauma for kind of paralyzing the people from any kind of uprisings throughout the history. So that's a kind of the opposite side of the case. And also the question, I was wondering if you have come across any study or a theory that categorizes people born with disabilities under the category of PTSD. People born with disabilities under PTSD, because it's kind of continuous trauma. It doesn't have the P. So I was wondering if you've seen any studies or theories that categorize people with disabilities under PTSD.
So to the first question, if I heard you right, absolutely. I mean, so what I think, and the Dirty War is an example of that. I think torture is not a good way of getting intelligence. And the Dirty War, it was a catastrophic way of getting intelligence. It just produced all kinds of bad data that caused bad policing and bad investigation. Torture is really good at terrorizing a population. And broken bodies and torture can be a way of stifling dissent. And so, yes, absolutely. It's a political strategy in that case. That second question is very, very interesting. and I'm really trying to pull up some file in my head so I can sound smart about it. But I think my answer is now I want to read about that as a question. Do you know of any?
No, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I would say, so what I do know from disability studies is you might bifurcate it into sort of accident-related disabilities and born with, say, disabilities, and there might be a differential sense of identity in relation to one. So one might be just disability isn't a problem or isn't a deficit. It is who I am. It is my identity. Versus someone who's reinventing their body halfway through life because of a traumatic physical injury. I might imagine there'd be different ways of approaching it there, but really now I'm just casting out. I'm not sure.
Well, thank you all. I'm sorry I'm going to have to draw it to a close because we're at time. But thank you all so much for your questions. Apologies to those of you who didn't get a chance to answer, but let's thank James once more. Thank you. Thank you.